Welcome back to another one of your Flip Lectures. Today we're going to discuss the 1980s into the early 1990s. Though we already discussed this in class, I'm going to briefly go over the two main competing ideologies in United States politics, liberalism and conservatism. These two ideologies are going to disagree on a few fundamental differences about the role of the government in the lives of American citizens. Liberals are going to tend to believe in something called active government. This means that they believe that the government is a force for good and that it should be very active in the economy and in the lives of its citizens. Because of this, they believe that the government should regulate, which means make rules that basically govern the economy, and also rules that say what businesses can and cannot do. They also believe that it is the role of government to create social programs that are aimed at helping the impoverished and disadvantaged in the United States. In contrast, conservatives believe in something called limited government. This means that they distrust the federal government because they believe that basically the federal government in Washington, D.C. is incapable of dealing with the very diverse problems of the United States. They tend to believe that state and local governments should be the ones making the most decisions. A good example of this is that conservatives will say that New York is very different than Texas, which is very different than Iowa, which is very different than California. Conservatives also believe that the government should not have much power to intrude in the lives of citizens. That means that basically they don't want the government making a lot of rules governing what people can and cannot do. They also believe that the government should not regulate businesses. This is called free enterprise. And conservatives believe that rules about business are expensive and actually hurt the productivity of businesses. They believe that if businesses were free to do as they wished, that they would be able to create more wealth, more jobs, which would result in a better situation for all Americans. Another fundamental disagreement is on taxes and spending. Liberals tend to believe that there should be higher taxes, and especially higher taxes on the wealthy. This is because government programs, social programs, cost money. And so the government will need to collect more money through taxes, and they believe that the wealthiest Americans should pay more taxes in order to help those who are disadvantaged. Conservatives are going to disagree. They're going to advocate for lower levels of spending and lower taxes on all Americans. They oppose the idea of wealth transfer, taking from those who have more to give to those who have less. They're going to oppose that idea. They're also going to say that high taxes are going to discourage people from investing money and trying to expand businesses and create more wealth. They're also going to say that it is going to discourage people to work harder, knowing that if they make more money, they're going to have to pay more taxes. So conservatives believe that higher taxes are harmful for the economy because it will prevent people from investing and creating new businesses. One key tenet of liberalism is that the government should not regulate any social behavior, and it is the role of the government to protect cultural minorities. This basically refers to religion, culture, free speech, sexual behavior, or any other groups of minorities inside the United States. They believe that the government should not pass laws that try to legislate morality, whereas conservatives are going to tend to believe in those traditional values that we talked about with the Great Silent Majority. And the fundamental disagreement between liberalism and conservatism is where each ideology believes that the problems of the country come from. Liberals tend to believe that social problems are mostly a result of economic inequality. And so because of that, they will look to the government in order to solve the problems of economic inequality and therefore solve the problems of the country. Conservatives tend to believe that the problems of the nation are a result of character morality issues, meaning that the reason there are problems is because individuals make choices that cause these problems to happen. So therefore, conservatives will not look to the government to solve these problems, but they will look to individual citizens and communities to try to solve the problems of the nation. So these two ideologies are going to dominate United States politics and are going to come to be the biggest discussion points during the Reagan presidency. So the political landscape in the United States has changed over time. The ideas of liberalism had dominated the 20th century from about 1900 to 1980. The New Deal during the Great Depression and the Great Society under President Johnson involved a lot of government regulations on businesses, economic welfare programs and anti-poverty measures, and other such expansions of the federal government. However, conservatism began to make a comeback during the Cold War. because of the Cold War, a lot of Americans are going to believe that liberal economic ideas, the idea of basically anti-poverty programs and wealth transfer, are going to be socialist and therefore potentially communist. And so a lot of Americans, for fear of communism, are going to start to move towards conservative ideas. Regional changes in the United States are also going to lead to conservatism growing. The Northeast, which is a bastion of liberal ideas, is basically going to start to shrink, whereas the Sun Belt in the South and Western United States is going to start to grow. And these areas are not going to favor a lot of government programs and regulations because of their demographics and because of their rapid development. Also, suburban Americans are going to express anger over high taxes and inflation, and they are also going to move towards conservative ideas, wanting the idea of low taxes and low regulation. And religious Americans, in their desire to retain traditional values, are also going to start to support conservative candidates. Here's a picture of the Sun Belt. And during the 1970s and into the 1980s, this region of the country started to develop very rapidly in industry and business. And so therefore, their populations grew and they had a lot more political power than they had in the past. In 1980, the Republican Party decided to run Ronald Reagan for the President of the United States. At the time, he was the governor of California, and he had been the spokesman for conservative ideas for decades. And in 1980, Reagan is going to win the presidency, and conservative Republicans are going to win the Senate, meaning that the Republicans would have the Senate and the presidency for the first time since 1954. And this was called the Reagan Revolution because it was such a conservative triumph over those liberal ideas that had existed before. Here's a picture of the electoral map for 1980. As you can see, it was a huge landslide for Ronald Reagan, winning almost every state, and some of these states by a very wide margin. This meant that Reagan believed that he had a mandate in order to basically take the country in a new direction. Before he was president, Ronald Reagan was actually a very famous actor, and he was a very beloved governor of California. Ronald Reagan had been a very famous conservative for a long time, ever since a campaign ad that he did in 1964 for the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater. And Reagan is going to bring a very different perspective to American politics. Where for decades the United States had looked to government to solve their problems, Ronald Reagan says government is not the solution, government is the problem. And so Reagan is basically going to look to limit government. He's also going to call on Americans to start to believe in themselves again. Reagan believed that the problems of the 1970s came from a lack of confidence that Americans had in themselves. And so he challenged Americans to believe in themselves, and he challenged them to solve the problems of the nation. Immediately, Ronald Reagan changed the United States' approach to the economy. And his approach is going to become known as Reaganomics. And Reaganomics is going to be a combination of two ideas. One of them is an idea from the monetarist theory of economics that basically says that inflation, one of the problems of the 1970s, is caused by having too much currency out in the economy. And so he advocated raising the interest rates, the amount of money that you have to pay more than what you borrow, in order to basically lower the amount of money that people would borrow. Because if you know that you're going to have to pay a lot of money back later, you're going to be a lot more cautious about the amount of money you're going to borrow. He also put in supply-side economics, the idea that having lower taxes on businesses and individuals would mean that those investors and those businesses would spend that extra money in order to expand their businesses and try to create more wealth. And so the belief of supply-side economics is that increased wealth come from lower taxes is going to equal more jobs for Americans, which would solve the problems of poverty. And so Reaganomics was hoping to turn the economy around. But it's one thing for Reagan to have these big ideas, it's another to get them passed. And so Reagan engaged in a number of budget battles with the Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. And so before we get into these budget battles, I want to talk about the definition of budget deficit. The budget deficit is the amount of money that you spend more than what you have. A debt is all of the collected deficits. And so Ronald Reagan wanted to make a balanced budget. but he also wanted to cut taxes. And so Reagan's first priority is to cut taxes, and he's actually going to negotiate a full 25% tax cut for Americans. However, that also removed revenue, 25% revenue, so the government had less money. In order to try to make up for having less money, Ronald Reagan tried to negotiate cuts in spending for social programs. And basically, these compromises meant cuts for welfare, less money for food stamps, Medicare, and other social programs. However, he was unable to cut enough to make up for the lack of taxes. And so Reagan's attempt to balance the budget will ultimately fail, because the lower tax rate, combined with not enough spending cuts, combined with his large military spending, is going to equal a very unbalanced budget. And so the government is actually going to run big deficits during Reagan's presidency, which he had hoped not to do. But Reagan's policies are going to do very well in the private economy. It is going to lead to a massive economic expansion and widespread wealth creation. Unemployment is going to be very, very low in the 1980s, and incomes are going to rise by 15%. However, how he achieved this is up for debate today. A lot of people think that his cuts to social programs hurt a lot of Americans, and that basically the disadvantaged Americans suffered. Reagan also got rid of many business regulations, and basically he got rid of energy price controls that had been put in place by President Carter. He opened up more public land for drilling, logging, and mining, basically trying to increase the use of America's natural resources, and he also reduced environmental regulations, giving businesses a lot more leeway in how they conducted their factories and how they did their business. Because of these things, Reaganomics to this day is still very controversial. Ronald Reagan would also change the makeup of the Supreme Court and would appoint several conservative justices to the highest court in the land, including the first woman to ever be a Supreme Court justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. He will also appoint William Rehnquist, Antonin Scalia, and Anthony Kennedy, who was not a conservative, who was a moderate, to the Supreme Court. So to this day, Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy are still on the Supreme Court, meaning that Ronald Reagan's choices for the judicial branch are still having an impact today. And Sandra Day O'Connor was seen as a true trailblazer as the first female Supreme Court justice. Reagan's foreign policy is going to be different than previous presidents. Reagan is going to reject the policy of containment. He did not believe that the United States should just contain communism. Reagan wanted to defeat the Soviet Union and win the Cold War. Ronald Reagan, in a speech, called the Soviet Union the evil empire, which gives you an idea of basically Ronald Reagan's perspective on the Cold War. And how he sought to do his foreign policy was a concept called peace through strength, which basically meant a massive buildup of military power in the United States, spending $1.5 trillion on defense over 5 years during his presidency. The idea of this was, one, that the United States would be so strong that no country would dare attack it, but also to get the Soviet Union locked into an arms race where they were trying to keep up with the amount of spending and technology that the United States had, and get them into that arms race that they couldn't afford. The United States economy was much stronger than the Soviet Union's, and so the USSR would likely go bankrupt trying to keep up with all of the military spending. So Ronald Reagan, during his presidency, tried to win the Cold War, not just to contain communism. He also put forth the Reagan Doctrine, in which his White House would support any anti-communist rebel groups around the globe. For instance, he supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan who were fighting the Soviet Union. The Mujahideen, a lot of these people, would go on to actually fight against the United States in later conflicts. One of the big leaders of the Mujahideen was actually Osama bin Laden. But the United States supported this group at the time because they were fighting against the Soviet Union. In Nicaragua, a new government went into place that was a socialist government. And the Reagan White House did not want Nicaragua to be a socialist government. And so they helped fund a group called the Contras. They were basically a very violent group that sought to overthrow the government of Nicaragua through military force. The United States also invaded the country of Grenada in the Caribbean when Grenada became a communist country. U.S. soldiers actually went into the country, removed the leaders, and made sure that a democratic government went into place that would be pro-United States. So the Reagan Doctrine was very controversial because of the United States' involvement in all these conflicts, and it still remains controversial to this day. As part of the Reagan Doctrine, there was also a big scandal during Ronald Reagan's administration. It became known as the Iran-Contra affair. And this was when the Reagan administration, so not the president himself, but people who worked for him, secretly sold weapons to the country of Iran, the hostile country of Iran, remember that Iran hostage crisis, in exchange for the release of some hostages that were being held, some secret hostages. And on top of this, the money that they made from the arms sale was sent to the Contras who were fighting against the government in Nicaragua. There were two problems with this. The first is that it was illegal to sell weapons to Iran. They were subject of a full embargo by the United States. And also, the Congress had passed laws saying that it was illegal for the United States to continue to fund these Contras. And so it was basically proven that the Reagan administration had broken the law twice. Even though these scandals were not linked directly to President Reagan, it was linked to some of his advisors, and as a result, this scandal is going to hurt Reagan's respect amongst some Americans. In the mid-1980s, the Cold War started to come to a close. A new leader of the Soviet Union came into power, a guy by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev started meeting with Reagan, even though he knew that Ronald Reagan was very anti-Soviet. And Ronald Reagan is going to actually give a very famous speech in front of the Berlin Wall where he is going to challenge the Soviet Union to start reforming and changing their ways. And under Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership, the Soviet Union did indeed start to change during the mid to late 1980s. Ronald Reagan delivered a very, very famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate at the Berlin Wall. Remember, the Berlin Wall is this big symbol of the Cold War. And so Ronald Reagan basically challenged Mikhail Gorbachev to live up to what he was saying about wanting peace and prosperity for the world. And so in a very famous line, Ronald Reagan says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So the Cold War is going to start to wind down once the Soviet Union puts in major changes. The economy of the Soviet Union was struggling mightily. And part of this was because they were spending way too much money trying to keep up with the United States during this arms race. So in a lot of ways, Reagan's strategy to win the Cold War actually worked. And two of these big reforms are going to be perestroika and glasnost. And perestroika means restructuring, which basically took away the hardline communist belief that there could be no private property or private business, that basically the government, the state, would own and run everything in the economy. Perestroika allowed some private businessmen to start businesses in the Soviet Union. Then there was the policy of glasnost, which basically meant openness and allowing more freedom inside the Soviet Union. For the first time, freedom of religion was allowed. More free speech was allowed, and open political discussion was not punishable by imprisonment. As part of glasnost as well, the Soviet Union started negotiating much more with the United States and other European nations. So ultimately, these changes are going to lead to the Soviet Union collapsing. In 1989, peaceful revolutions in many of the satellite Soviet countries are going to start replacing communist governments. In Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, new governments are going to go into place peacefully, with the support of the people and without any sort of fighting back from the army or from Russia and the Soviet Union. And on November 9th of 1989, the Berlin Wall gates are formally open and the wall begins to be torn down. So this massive symbol of the Cold War is going to finally come down in 1989 and start to signal the end of the Soviet Union. But in 1989, a few hardline communists are going to try to take over the government in Russia. However, the takeover is going to fail, and the Russian people, 50,000 of them, are going to protect the new government inside the Parliament building from this military takeover. And so ultimately, the Communist Party is going to be outlawed in Russia, a new government is going to be elected, and the Soviet Union is officially going to be over. Here's a map so you can kind of see where some of these countries are that are going to declare themselves no longer communist before the Soviet Union finally does. Here's a photo of the Berlin Wall being torn down. You see people sitting on the wall, fireworks. It was a day of great celebration in the city of Berlin, the country of Germany, and around the world. And in December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev and the new president, Boris Yeltsin, are officially going to announce the end of the Soviet Union and the creation of a new Russian country. So in 1991, the Cold War is officially going to come to an end. And this is going to usher in a new era in world history where the United States is going to stand alone as the only world superpower. So let's talk a little bit about culture in the 1980s and how all of these political events are going to be reflected in culture. After the me-decade of the 1970s, the 1980s are going to become a decade of indulgence. The emphasis on new business and on wealth from the government is going to trickle into society, where the culture is going to start to celebrate wealth and status. Status symbols are going to become very important to people. Wearing designer clothes, driving certain cars, even having fancy watches is going to become a very, very important part of the 1980s culture. You're also going to have a new group of people who are going to be known as yuppies, young urban professionals who are really going to take this culture of indulgence very seriously. The Yuppie Handbook was kind of a parody that was published making fun of these yuppies and their emphasis on status. As you can see, these people are wearing all designer clothes, and basically this is poking fun at that idea. Technology and culture are also going to go through massive changes. The introduction of the Sony Walkman is going to mean that people are going to be able to walk around with headphones on and listen to cassette tapes, which is going to change culture, because for the first time you're going to have people walking around wearing headphones, listening to their music, being in their own world. The VCR is going to mean that you no longer have to go to the movies, that you can watch movies at home, and this is also going to create large cultural changes. Cable and satellite television are going to replace basically the 5 to 7 channels that you used to be able to watch. As a result of this, new channels are going to come up that are going to be for specialized audiences. For example, CNN is going to be the very first 24-hour news network aimed at specific audiences. MTV is going to be created in order to target youth audiences. And with these specialized audiences are going to come specialized advertisements and the increase of branding. And then also video games are going to be introduced, and that's going to have an impact on future culture as well. Here's a picture of the Sony Walkman. The original MTV logo. The very first cable boxes. The Atari video game console. And television and film in the 80s are also going to reflect this culture. The TV show Dallas is going to be one of the most popular shows, and it is going to celebrate this culture of indulgence. It's going to celebrate wealth and status and all of the things that go with it. And it's going to be a very, very famous TV show. I also want to point out The Cosby Show, where America's Favorite Family, one of the #1 shows, is going to be about an African American family. This would be impossible without the civil rights movements of the 1960s, and also the cultural changes in television during the 1970s. But Bill Cosby and his fictional family are going to become the major cultural influence on families, and is going to further the idea of basically minorities being an accepted and valued part of American society. There's also going to be a change in films, where you're going to have a rash of what I like to call Reagan-era films. The movie Rocky IV pits the heroic Rocky, representing the United States, against the Soviet Union, represented by the large Russian Ivan Drago. And this movie reflects a lot of the values of the Reagan era, where basically America was trying to win the Cold War, not just trying to contain it. The movie Red Dawn, starring Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen, is going to deal with a fictional invasion of the United States by the Soviet Union and this group of heroic individual students who are going to rise up in order to fight the invasion. These movies celebrated the increased patriotism and attitude during the Cold War brought on by Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. But the 80s are going to have a lot of social problems. Along with the wealth came a lot of problems. There's going to be an epidemic of drug and alcohol use in the 1980s, including the crack epidemic that is going to devastate a lot of cities. With this increased drug trade, gangs are going to become an even bigger problem in the 80s, and they're going to become much more violent as more money is going to be involved in the drug trade. As a result, the country is going to react. The Just Say No campaign was started by Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife, and a rash of anti-drug campaigns were launched throughout the United States. The national drinking age was also raised to 21 during this time in order to try to combat a lot of alcohol-related problems and drunk driving deaths. Crime is going to go up in the 1980s, and they're going to link this to a lot of the drug abuse and the increase in gang violence. The AIDS epidemic is also going to become big news during the 1980s, where there's going to be a lot of misconceptions, but for the first time this disease is going to be dealt with in the public sector. And also homelessness is going to become a big problem in the 1980s, where a lot of the budget cuts of Reaganomics are going to contribute to some mentally ill persons, veterans, and people who had been on government relief ending up homeless on the streets of many of the major cities. This is another reason why Reaganomics continues to be controversial to this day. Here's a picture of the Just Say No campaign, TV commercial. Here's a picture of a news report on the crack epidemic. There were Time magazine articles and ads and television commercials meant to basically raise awareness about AIDS. Even though the United States had won the space race to the moon, the space program did not completely shut down. The space program would continue into the 1980s, with the invention of the space shuttle and the missions that it would do. And in 1983, the first American woman is going to go to space, a woman astronaut by the name of Sally Ride. There's going to be a lot of space shuttle missions that are going to inspire the country, and this is really going to be a marvel of technology and engineering. However, not all of these flights are going to be successful. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger is going to explode during takeoff and is going to claim the lives of all of the astronauts on board. This Challenger disaster is going to be a national tragedy, and it's going to make some people question the space program. But ultimately, the United States would continue on with space exploration, even inventing and putting into space the very first space station, Skylab. After Skylab, the United States started working with other countries on the construction of the International Space Station, which is actually still in use today. Here's a picture of the space shuttle in orbit around the Earth. Another angle of the space shuttle. Here's a picture of Skylab, the first American space station. And ultimately, here's what we take away from the 1980s. The conservative revolution is going to lead to a new ideological power struggle in American politics that is ultimately still going on into this day. It's also going to bring with it different attitudes about the economy and some significant economic changes. And ultimately, the 80s are going to see the end of the Cold War and the start of the United States having to come to terms with its place in the New World Order.